I'm Tim Lau, Dr. Lau. I run our geriatric inpatient unit here. I'm also the president of the medical staff at this hospital. And I used to run our undergraduate program, so the program for our med students. And I used to run our postgraduate program, so the program for training psychiatrists. And for many years I was on the Royal College. I chaired committees at the Royal College, and we certify people to be able to practice psychiatry. So that's something else I've done over the years. My work in the university, I'm one of the distinguished teachers in our faculty, so we spent a whole year trying to improve our ability to teach, which was kind of a fun thing. So teaching in the university is something I like doing, so giving talks is something I enjoy doing. I remember when we were trying to learn to teach, we had these improv classes, and people were trying to show us how to use drama and acting to teach our medical students, and that was a lot of fun. I won't be doing any improv today, so don't worry. So I think when I've given talks across the country, the thing that impresses people the most is actually that I am the father of 6 children. And people sometimes say, is it with the same wife? And I say yes. But I obviously have great joy in my children and also in my work. And I can say that I'll talk about this later in the talk, but the importance of harmonics and trying to, you don't necessarily have to sacrifice one part of your life to have happiness in another. All right, so maybe I'll begin. I guess that's an introduction of myself. Happiness is something that we all personally have an interest in, and since I started giving talks on it, I have an even greater interest. The Nobel laureate Gabriel Garcia Marquez once said that happiness cures what medicine cannot. And I think the point of it is happiness goes beyond medicine. And it's part of our human condition, and it is certainly something that we all have a vested interest in. So the objectives of tonight's talk are to discuss what happiness is, to explore the science of happiness, and to discuss how to find happiness and to help others be happy. So here's a quote. When I was 5 years old, my mom always told me that happiness was the key to life. When I went to school, they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wrote down happy. They told me I didn't understand the assignment, and I told them they didn't understand life. Now, whether or not this is attributed to John Lennon, I think the message is important. And the message is that the thing that we seek ultimately is happiness. A recent poll of millennials found and asked the question, what is the most important thing, the most important life goal you have? Does anyone have a guess at what the biggest life goal that millennials have? It's amazing because the thing that they wanted, this is a survey of about 8.7 million kids. They looked at high school seniors and also those entering university. And they compared baby boomers with Gen X's and Gen Y's and looked and asked them what the most important thing they had as a life goal. And the thing that's interesting is that things change. And for the baby boomers, those that entered university or finished high school, the desire to be rich was only 45% as a main goal, compared to now almost 75%. That's the number one goal of millennials, is to be rich. Whereas for the baby boomers, it was number 8 of their list of primary goals in life. So you can see that money is certainly what I think millennials want, but what millennials want is to be happy. And the reason that they want to have money is so that they can be happy. it's interesting because the other thing that they really want is to be famous. So the reality, though, is, people are trying to be rich or famous so that they can be happy. No one tries to be happy so that they can be rich or famous. It's the true direction is happiness. And we all seek happiness. Whether or not it's the beatific vision or heaven or bliss or nirvana, we are all seeking happiness whether or not we consciously are aware of it. Pascal said in the 17th century that even those that commit suicide are trying to be happier. We are all seeking happiness as an end and never as a means. But if that's the case, why is it such a fuzzy concept? Well, would you be happier winning a lottery or breaking your neck? What do you guys think the answer to that question is? Usually when I give these talks, someone says they want to try at least the lottery. But you might be surprised at the answer. Dan Gilbert, he's a psychologist from Harvard, actually reviewed the data. And surprisingly, 1 year later, there is no difference. Now, what happens to those that win lotteries, especially to those that did not have money to begin with? Their lives changed completely for the worst, many of them, or most of them. Why? If you can imagine, if you suddenly start having a lot of money, every person you call, you're going to start doubting why they're calling you. And many of the people who actually win lotteries, they end up going into debt. So you end up poorer financially, but also poorer personally. They lose what's really important, which are the people in their lives. Now, what about people who suffer spinal cord traumas? The surprising thing is paraplegics are actually often quite happy people. This is again from Dan Gilbert's TED Talk. And as you can see, at 1 year, that there's no difference between lottery winners and paraplegics. Blind people often say that the worst thing that they experience is that everyone assumes that they're sad. So people who suffer from some injury, the thing that they struggle with most is that the perception everyone thinks that their life is terrible, which is not the case. I think it's the triumph of the human spirit that allows us to overcome adversity, and even in the face of the bleakest situations, have a sense of humor. Christopher Reeve isn't unique to many of the people who have gone through traumas. I have spoken to the former Minister of State for Transport, Stephen Fletcher, many times. He suffered a quad accident in his late 20s and became 24-hour dependent for care. He's actually still 24-hour dependent for care. And he told me about what his experience was like and how much he struggled in the first few months after the accident. He told me that he could never know for sure if he'd be able to breathe, take his next breath. Even in the hospital, he was unable to speak for several months, and he was told that he would never be able to leave an institution. But he later joked that he didn't think the institution was Parliament. He also has a good sense of humor. He says, at least I'm not paralyzed from the neck up. I do think, though, that having less actually may help us see what is important and help us value what we have. I remember watching a TED Talk, and I think it's true. If you look at people who are in Africa, this fellow who gave this TED Talk from Norway, because Norway usually is the country that tops the happiness charts in countries, and he took pictures of people in Norway in the subways, and everyone looked miserable. It was quite funny. He was showing all these pictures, everyone looked sad, and then he'd show these pictures of people in Africa, and everyone's smiling and happy. There does seem to be, at times, a disconnect, right, between what we think happiness is. But happiness is more than just a good feeling. It's not just an emotion. And the connections to health are very interesting and, I would say, groundbreaking. People who are happier tend to live longer. They are healthier. They have lower rates of coronary artery disease, hypertension. They have better self-esteem and a better quality of life. But a lot of people spend money on meditation or yoga classes or life coaching or happiness apps. It's actually a huge industry. It's almost as big as Hollywood. But part of the solution may not lie so much in a product or a program, but simply a better understanding of what happiness is. But it is part of the universal search since the beginning of recorded human history. All of the philosophers talked about it, and it's been a topic of obvious interest in the point of view of religion and psychology, sociology, and economics. In fact, it's interesting because economics tries to look at things in terms of numbers and maximizing things. And you can actually quantify and compare, for example, gross national happiness, which is an attempt to maximize happiness at the scale of a country, as opposed to its GDP or its productivity. And in recent years, several countries have started developing indices for happiness, including our country. The Canadian Index of Well-Being was developed in 2011 and has 64 items. But Australia and China, also France and Britain, have developed their own scales to measure happiness. Now, when you look at, from the point of view of an economist, you want numbers and you want objective data. So how do you generate objective data? Well, if you look at things objectively, lifespan can be a proxy for health, education can be a proxy for freedom, and income can be a proxy for wealth. So looking at things just purely from an objective point of view, Canada and Norway do very well. Canada placed 10th last year. And objectively, the UN Human Development Index, which is a measure of those three different indices, shows that the world is actually increasing across all the three of these things. Globally, we're doing better in terms of lifespan and education and income. But it's interesting because North Korea also does their own happiness index. And they scored behind China, which is number two behind China. So you can imagine that subjective levels of happiness, if not connected to something objective, what does it mean? Let's say you're brainwashed or attached by a chain to a bed or something like that. You might be brainwashed into thinking you're happy, and subjectively you may even be so. But is that true happiness if there's not a connection to something objective? So, if you look at the UN report says that hunger and malnutrition are widespread in North Korea, despite this fact that, assuming the survey data is accurate, that people in North Korea are happy. That's obviously a big assumption. And happiness economics also tries to look at different measures beyond just income and life expectancy, but also social supports, freedom, generosity, corruption. And the input of the subjective part is they use a measure of positive emotions versus negative emotions. So they develop a dystopia index, so kind of a balance between these objective and subjective measures. And if you look at it from that point of view, again, Norway does pretty well, as does Canada. But if you remember back in the 70s, the King of Bhutan developed this concept of gross national happiness that was put into their constitution in 2008 as an alternative to the GDP. But what's happened to Bhutan? It consistently doesn't do well in terms of these measures of happiness, despite attempts to focus on subjective happiness, looking at survey data, sustainability, various socially positive things. But it didn't help the objective problems in Bhutan, which were a ballooning debt, unemployment, growing corruption, and allegations of ethnic cleansing and human rights abuses. So the point being, just focusing on subjective things without something objective doesn't give you necessarily happiness. And it's actually hard to combine the two. It's like sort of adding apples and oranges together, a mixture of apples and oranges, and saying which one's better. Because something that's subjective and something objective, how do you combine a person's subjective state of happiness with these objective measures like lifespan and health? It's actually kind of hard to do. So this is a cartoon that says, how do you measure it? Guilty. So Pascal notes, again in the 17th century, from Pascal's Penses, that for thousands of years, mankind has been striving without success to resolve some basic human problems. We all want to live in harmony with one another. We want to raise our children well, and we want our lives to matter. But why is it that the search for happiness has largely been a pursuit? We can see that there are problems with our pursuit of happiness. In 2013, I don't know if you guys have heard of NICE, but it's a government agency looking at developing guidelines, and they suggested that schools systematically try and measure happiness in education and try to increase levels of happiness because they perceive that something was happening. Because despair does seem to be on the rise. Can we say that we are really happy as a society when depression is becoming so much more common? And it's growing at an alarming rate. If you look at data from the ECA, this is the Epidemiological Catchment Area Study, if you were born in 1905 to 1914, in comparison to if you were born between 1955 to 1964, you were, by orders of magnitude, much more likely to be depressed if you were born later on. Every 10-year successive cohort we've looked at, rates of depression are going up. So why is that? This is from Maclean's front page. This problem of this campus crisis. Why do we have this broken generation? And if you look at suicide statistics, over the last 50 years, rates of suicide for youths have gone up 500 or 600%. This is data just published just a few weeks ago. This is from the CDC, looking at adolescents in the States. So looking at about 500 adolescents from grades 8 to grade 12 over a 5-year span. And one thing that was surprising is, over this time, rates of depression climbed 33%, and there was a 31% increase in suicide. Of interest, if you look at one of the associations that they found in this large study, the use of screen time. If you have more than 5 hours of screen time, your likelihood of having at least one suicidal behavior is about 50%. Keeping in mind that 92% of teens have smartphones, or cell phones. Most of them are smartphones. And depression is becoming, when I was in med school, they were saying it's going to become the leading cause of disability. In 2012, the World Health Organization published a paper that said that it actually was the leading cause of disability worldwide. So 10 times more people now suffer from major depression than they did in 1945. And about 1 million people are lost to suicide every year across the world. In fact, in the States, more people die from suicide than from homicide. So why is it that so many people seem lost? I would argue that at least for some, perhaps they don't know what they're looking for, they don't know what will make them happy, and they don't know what happiness is. So for many people, who here has heard of the pleasure principle? So it was, kind of developed by John Stuart Mill, Bentham, and then taken up by John Stuart Mill, and further expanded upon by Freud. But the idea is that happiness is simply the equation of pleasure minus pain. And I think a lot of people think of happiness that way, that it is purely a thing of balancing pleasure and pain. Freud actually said, the goal of the pleasure principle of becoming happy is not attainable, but we may not, nay cannot give up the efforts to come near to the realization of it by some means or another. So he actually realized that using and aiming for pleasure as its own end is unsatisfying. It couldn't be satisfying. And it's often imprecisely equated with pleasure. Who here has heard of the paradox of hedonism or this concept of hedonic adaptation? So several people have had. So the idea is when you experience something pleasurable, the pleasure of it diminishes after each time you experience it. And I think that's true of our own experience. You know, if you imagine eating a chocolate cake or something, the first bite is exquisite, but then, you know, if you eat 5 or 6 pieces of cake, it's kind of disgusting at the end. Alex Schopenhauer once said, "To attain something desired is to discover how vain it is." And I think we've all had this experience of wanting something is better than actually having it. I remember when the newest iPhone came out, I wanted to get it. I was thinking it's going to make me so happy. Obviously, it doesn't. Like, I can tell you that right now. But we've all had that experience of wanting to get something, and then when you finally get it, it's actually not as great as it was when you were wanting it. And this is something it resonates with our experience, I believe. It's actually said that the best thing to do is to plan vacations and never go on them. Probably after a while you're going to realize you're not going to go on the vacation, so it might not work in your mind. But wanting something is often better than having it. Now, I gave this talk in Toronto to the Ontario Hospitals Association, and one of the geriatricians said, "You had me until you started talking about the shoes." Because apparently there's something about shoes that I don't quite understand, but there may have something mystical about them. Andy Nodzik, who is a philosopher, did a thought experiment that we can actually do tonight, which is try to imagine yourself and you're given the question that you can experience unending levels of pleasure till the point that you die. Would you actually do it? Now there's a catch. It has to be introduced artificially with a machine. So when I've asked audiences this before, 99% of people say they wouldn't want that. And it's because we realize that pleasure isn't the thing we actually want more than anything. You know, it was actually done in the 50s with these rats, the Olds and Milner studies, where they put these electrodes from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, and these rats would push these things 900 times an hour, and they wouldn't eat or drink, and they would die. They actually had a case of that at the Douglas Institute where they had introduced electrodes, the same kind of thing. A person became addicted to electrical self-stimulation. So it's not that far-fetched an idea, and it's not that far from the idea of how drugs work in the same reward pathway. So most people realize that that's not what they want. Why? I think for most of us, for happiness to be real, for it to be lasting, we realize that it has to be earned or it has to be chosen. There has to be some active thing on our own part for happiness to happen. And we realize that pleasure is not the same thing as joy, and that pain is not the same thing as suffering. If you can imagine these concepts of pleasure and pain, what kind of thing gives pleasure and reduces pain? Well, one thing are opioids. And we have the opioid crisis that is continuing to become more and more obvious as a public health disaster. 16 people each day have opioid poisonings and require hospitalizations in Canada. And the rates of hospitalizations have gone up 53% in the last 10 years. So what do opioids do? They give you a sense of a high, but they also reduce pain. And you can see that, you know, intuitively, if you wanted to have more pleasure and less pain, you could see that you would start down the road of opioids. Now, obviously with opioids, there's more to it, because there is the problem of addiction and, you know, losing a sense of control. There's a physiological addiction as well as a psychological one. Many people don't realize that Sigmund Freud actually had a problem with cocaine. And he thought it was the miracle drug at the time. He thought it could cure heroin addiction for or morphine addiction for one of his friends. And the subject he liked to practice the most with was himself. But I think it's true that modern man looks to quick fixes. we have a kind of cultural ADHD. We can't sustain our attention on things, and we want a quick fix. My kids now, I can see them when I ask them a question. Many of them look to Google to try and find the answer. It's because they can't tolerate thinking about things. They want an answer right away. And modern man is like that. We want to have a quick answer, a quick solution. So, what can happen when you're feeling bad is you want to banish the negative emotions with some sort of positive one. So you'll eat ice cream. If you think of Bridget Jones's Diary, or after you have a breakup, you can eat lots of ice cream. Or if you want to shop or something because you feel bad, it leaves you more unhealthy and poorer in the end. So it's like drugs. So if pleasure is not the same thing as happiness, what is happiness? How would you define it? I usually ask you guys to try to define happiness for all of us. So if you look at the most dictionaries or Wikipedia, the traditional definition of happiness is an emotional or a psychological state of well-being with emotions varying from contentment to joy. That's usually the textbook dictionary definition of happiness. But the problem is that's purely subjective. So how much of it can be just purely subjective? So just because you think and you experience those things, if it's actually not connected to something objective, how happy are you really? So if you look at the definition, the actual word happiness, its origin can be found in the word hap, which can be seen in words like happenstance or happens. So it involves this idea of luck or chance. So in this idea, happiness is something that happens passively to you. So like winning a lottery. So that's something that's going to happen, and then you're going to be happy. You're going to get this promotion, and then you're going to be happy. Or something's going to happen at work, or something's going to happen in a relationship, and then you're going to be happy. Right? Now, one of the things I would like to suggest is not to let that definition of happiness be your definition of happiness. The ancient view of happiness, following Aristotle, is this idea of eudaimonia, which refers to flourishing or human excellence in accord with reason. So I think you were talking about wisdom, but the idea is living a good life, and it's not so much an emotional state, but involves actions, and it involves a completed life in a sense. So it's a life that's the result of the goods that you choose. So I'd like to give you a prescription for happiness, and some of this prescription is based in science, but also in my experience in taking care of patients, elderly patients, for many years. So the first thing is, don't expect money to buy you happiness. Now it's a cliche for sure. People say, money doesn't buy you happiness. This is a cartoon, a Peanuts cartoon that says, happiness is not having to care about the recession because you're a cartoon. I think the truth, though, is our material needs do need to be met. In studies looking at comparing different countries, and also within our own country, when you look at happiness, Maslow in the 1950s introduced this hierarchy of needs. And at the bottom are our physiological needs. And I remember giving a talk to the people that run our shelters, and one of the persons was saying, how can our clients be happy if they don't have a safe place to live? If they are afraid, if it's cold, they don't have their basic needs. It's not impossible, but it's harder. So money can't buy us happiness, but still our basic needs are kind of primary thing. And if you look at happiness economics, if you compare El Salvador, for example, with Qatar, their level of subjective well-being is very similar, but their GDP per capita is several orders of magnitude different. And first of all, this is data from 2012. I think it's going to be completely different with Venezuela, but they didn't publish an update after they had all the riots and all those killings and stuff. Things didn't go well in Venezuela. But back in 2012, when they looked at their subjective levels of well-being, if you compared Botswana with Venezuela, they had a similar GDP per capita, but the subjective levels of happiness were very different. And similar level of subjective well-being with Qatar, but their income is actually obviously much higher. And in the States, if you look at levels of happiness, they've been fairly static. Like, I think if anything, they've gone down a little bit, but the average income has consistently increased every year. We have more stuff than we have ever had before. We have iPads and iPhones and creature conveniences and smartphones and things that would have been hard to imagine existing a decade ago. We have bigger cars and more things, but we're actually not any happier. Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton from Princeton, they did surveys and asked about 500,000 people questions relating to income and happiness. And they asked the question, what is the perfect salary for happiness? Does anyone know what the answer is?
70,000.
Yeah. The original estimate was 75,000. It's actually been downgraded. And now it's not necessarily that it's so much a perfect thing, but it's above 75,000. The threshold for moment-to-moment happiness doesn't go up. But there is a ladder because your sense objectively of life satisfaction does go up with increasing income. But above 75,000, there isn't any more increase in moment-to-moment happiness. So Daniel Kahneman actually won a Nobel Prize for some of this work. And this is data from that study. It's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2010. So Will Rogers once said, "Too many people buy things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't know." And I think that's true. We buy things because we have this sense of what people will think about us because we buy things. And G.K. Chesterton once said, there are two ways to get enough. One is to accumulate more and more, the other is to desire less. And I think this is a truism of life. It is more important who you live with than where. If you think about it, the place you live, how important is it when you compare to the people you live with? And the other thing that can happen when you have a lot of money is you perceive that you have a lot more choices. So Barry Schwartz is a psychologist who actually studied what happens when you have a lot of choices. And they found that after you've had more than 5 choices, the positive effect of having more choices is diminished by the negative effect of having more choices. Meaning, like if you went to a store and you saw 15, 20, 30 shampoos, it's overwhelming. And you start thinking there's something called lost opportunity costs. So any sort of benefit there is with having more choices is taken away thinking, what am I missing? And if you can imagine what happens to people with a lot of money, they think they're missing a lot of stuff because they have a lot of options. They can buy stuff and they think they can buy people. And that's a huge problem for people that have money. The other difficulty is when you have money, you have higher expectations. And Barry Schwartz actually is famous for saying the key to life is having low expectations. Who here is, what's a movie that you guys have seen that someone told you was terrible? Well, usually someone will tell you a movie is terrible, you go to see it, and the funny thing is, when you go see it, it's actually not that bad. And similarly, when someone says a movie is excellent, and you go see it, you're usually not that impressed. Why? It's because your expectations are high. Dr. Shaw, one of the colleagues that works with us, gave me a book called The Book of Awesome, and one of the startings to the chapter says, happiness is not having to wait in line in a store. It's because you expect to wait in line. You know, if you're at Costco or something, or someplace where it's always busy, if you go and you don't have to wait, you feel good, you feel happy. So there is an inverse relationship between reality and expectations. The second prescription is to live with integrity. So Gandhi once said, happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. So it's important for us to be authentic, provided you're not an authentic jerk or an authentic heroin addict. And it's important to follow your conscience. If you aren't living according to what you know to be right, you won't be happy, no matter how much you're achieving. There's actually a saying in Chinese that, you can never judge the wealth of a person until you see the state of a person's soul. And Gandhi talks about these 7 deadly sins: wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, science without humility, politics without principle, commerce without morality, worship without sacrifice, and knowledge without character. So the great minds of antiquity understood that virtue was connected to happiness. In fact, even Epicurus, who's the father of modern hedonism, recognized that the pleasurable life was a good life, a life of virtue. So the importance of character, and Aristotle and Plato recognized these 4 great virtues: fairness, courage, self-control, and wisdom. And in the self-control, there's also derivatives like humility. Now, Socrates included humility as one of the 5 great virtues. So a life of excellence is a life where you're fair to people, you live with courage, you can control yourself, and you're wise. And Eleanor Roosevelt once said that happiness is not a goal, it's a byproduct of a life well lived. So the third thing is to accept the things that you cannot change. And letting go of the illusion of control is very hard for us, because we think we control so many things in our lives, but actually the most important things in life we don't control. Who here chose your mother or your father? We don't choose our families. We don't choose what the people we love do. We don't choose our abilities, the challenges we have. None of those things do we choose. So accepting that is an important first step in life. Viktor Frankl, who is an Austrian psychiatrist that went through Auschwitz, said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." I remember talking to one of my patients about logotherapy. So Viktor Frankl's the father of modern logotherapy. And I remember talking to one of my patients about having meaning. And he was actually one of the patients in Auschwitz with him. And he was telling me about how he knew him and what he went through. So there is a wealth of knowledge in the patients that we treat and their experiences. I would say that one of the things that I have found helpful for patients is the Serenity Prayer. And in it is acceptance, courage, and wisdom. Now, accepting reality for the way it is doesn't mean that, accepting who you are doesn't mean you have to accept that it always has to stay that way. So it doesn't mean you can't improve your life if you accept it. One of the important things with acceptance that you can fall a trap into is fatalism. So saying that I accept the way things are, but they can't be any different. If you look at the survivors of the killing fields, in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, if you ask the survivors, they ask them, why didn't you run when people were shooting at you? They killed hundreds of thousands of people. Many of them said they thought they deserved to die, that they did something in a previous life, that they had no choice. We need to avoid fatalism. I remember one of the pediatricians that's a good friend of mine, she was telling me a story in Africa of a mother who had walked all this distance to try and help their baby, but you can run into this problem of just giving up, and that's not good either. In fact, the idea of dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a treatment for borderline personality disorder, involves the synthesis of 2 very different things, which one of them is radical acceptance with motivation to change. So you accept a person for who they are and where they are, but you don't just leave it there. You actually try and get them to move to a much better place. So acceptance alone isn't good enough. You need to have courage, which is the 4th prescription. So having the courage to change the right things that you can. One of the models for depression actually is learned helplessness. If you look at some of the animal models for depression, I don't know if you guys have heard of the forced swim test, but they do these things with these rats, and it's when they give up, that's the time that they give up. That's this idea of learned helplessness. But it is something our patients do experience. They feel like there's no hope. And that is something that we try to help them overcome, is a sense that there is hope, that things aren't complete, they aren't helpless. Again, this is from Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. You know, I found that to be a very powerful quote, because what he basically said was, even if you're facing a gas chamber and your end is at hand, the one thing you can choose is how you face your end. Your attitude is something you do control. So we do have control over something, even if we perceive that we have no control over nothing. And, you know, it's not just our attitude, but, you know, if you look at your assignment of purpose, which we'll talk about in a later section here, but also breathing. I've had patients who feel overwhelmed. You know, if you take 3 or 4 large, deep breaths, one thing you will notice is your heart rate will go down. And that is something you can gain a sense, at least, of control over your immediate circumstances. If you try it, you can actually lower your heart rate just by taking very big, deep breaths. And courage can make the difference. You know, as you sit here tonight, you can make the choice to face your fears or run away, to experience trust or doubt in people, or trust in the future, which is hope, or despair. Can you choose to believe that things can be better? Do you try to take a constructive view of life or a more destructive one? You know, are we willing to try or give up, and to live or die? And one of the things that Winston Churchill once said was, courage is the finest of human qualities because it guarantees the others. And the great social worker Anais Nin once said, life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage. If you look at the factors that are involved in happiness, Sonia Lyubomirsky from California and others in her group studied 1,100 pairs of identical twins raised discordantly, meaning raised in different environments. And what they found was only 10% of a person's happiness depends on their circumstances. 50% is genetic, and 40% involves the choices that they made in their life. So what that means is that 10% of happiness is external to you, 90% of happiness is internal. And if you go back to our original definition of happiness from a modern sense of things, happiness as waiting for good luck or waiting for something to change in your life for you to be happy, you're going to wait a long time because it doesn't have much of an effect on your happiness. That's that data that I showed you from Dan Gilbert. After you break your neck and winning a lottery, the circumstances of your life don't change your happiness that much. Your choices change things a whole lot more. Now, people sometimes say, well, if 50% of happiness is genetic, does that mean that you can't avoid being happy just because of the lottery of your genes? But I would say that personality is made up of 2 things. One is your temperament, and the other is your character. And so temperament is how you're wired, and character are the result of your habituated choices in life. So someone who's disorganized or lazy can become a SEAL and become incredibly regimented and disciplined by the choices that they make. So you can change your personality just like you can change your levels of happiness. Even if you're wired to look at things in more of a negative way, your choices can change the way that you perceive things and your own levels of happiness. But choices are really important, and that's something that we definitely have control over. And Katie Holmes says to Batman in Batman Begins, our choices are what define us. What defines you as you sit in this chair? Is it your family or your things that other people have done, or is it your own choices? The 5th thing to realize is that pain may be part of happiness. So who was the first to say no pain, no gain? Was it Robert Herrick, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jane Fonda, or Rabbi Ben Hay? It's actually Rabbi Ben Hay, and he said, according to the pain is the gain. And this is back in the 2nd century. This is not a new thing. It's not with Jane Fonda's Feel the Burn. Pain is realized as something that can help develop character, and it is true. Like when our hearts are stretched, they hurt. When we, when we struggle, that's often, how we experience greatness. The thing that makes, say, a run great or a challenge great is the adversity you overcome in it. And there's this mysterious connection between love and suffering. If you think of anything you've done as an act of love in the last few weeks, if there was no suffering in it, I will ask you how much love there was in it. Now, why would I say something so strange as that? Think about it. If you give something to somebody, and let's say you give money, and you have tons of money and it doesn't hurt at all, how much love is in there? Or if you spend time and you have absolutely no time at all, and it hurts you to spend this time on somebody, the proportion of how much pain there is proportional to how much love there is. When we experience love, that's actually when we are vulnerable and when we can experience pain. The greatest pain is when you really love something. When you have children, you understand that experience of how vulnerable you really are, because nothing that could have ever happened to you would be as painful as something happening to someone you love. So there's this weird connection between love and suffering in this world. And in Latin, many people don't realize that passion means suffering, and compassion means shared suffering. And this is a quote from The Lord of the Rings. This is Frodo to Gandalf. Actually, it was Gandalf to Frodo. Oh, back and forth. It says, I wish the ring had never come to me. And he says, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not up to us to decide. What we have to decide is what to do with the time that we have been given. I think it's a profound message. And if the ring, in this case, is a metaphor for suffering, none of us chooses to have cancer or depression or any of the challenges we have. But we can decide to do with what we have. Playing the cards that you've been dealt. As Helen Keller once said, when one door of happiness closes, another one opens, but we often look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one that has been opened for us. Happy people actually tend to be resilient. And their resilience comes from grappling with adversity and overcoming it, rather than being stuck. This is a picture of Amy Mullins. She was born with fibular hemimelia. Essentially, she was born without lower legs, and she's seen here running on a beach with these artificial legs. And she has this great talk on a TED Talk on adversity and how she says that this is the genesis of creativity and transformation. It's actually when you are challenged with something like that and you face a great obstacle and you overcome it. That's really where you have a tremendous growth. It's the struggle of the human spirit. Henry Ford once said, when everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. And many people don't realize that 12 presidents in the United States lost their fathers when they were young. 12 of the 45 presidents lost their fathers at an early age. Edwin Lewis Cole once said, you don't drown by falling in water, you drown by staying there. And that's an important message for us. When we fall, if we stay where we are, we're not going to get any better. It is a kind of giving in to despair. And this is from Spider-Man 3, sometimes the greatest battle lies within. For many of us, that is the battle we experience. It's an internal struggle. The sixth suggestion is to keep in mind we are often wrong. So Stephen Covey once said in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you can learn a great many things from your mistakes when you aren't busy denying them. In fact, the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy for depression is precisely that, overcoming distortions in the way you think. The underlying premise being, if you have a faulty way of thinking, you have a faulty way of feeling. So if you perceive the future and yourself to be terrible, and it's not true, you will feel terrible. And again, it's not true. So these distortions are things that we have to overcome. And Gandhi once says, someone cannot take away your self-esteem unless you give it to them. You know, it's a very powerful thing to realize that our sense of ourself shouldn't depend on what other people think of us. But it's something we all experience. We doubt, we worry a lot about how people see us. The seventh thing is to strive for balance and moderation. Now, if you go to a wellness week, you'll often see this, it's called the wellness wheel. And the idea is you try to have balance in your life. And the point is it's important to have emotional, social, occupational, physical, intellectual, spiritual balance in life. Plato once said, the part can never be well unless the whole is well. And I think that's true. We need to have things in each of these kind of categories for us to achieve happiness. But I like the idea of harmonics, meaning it doesn't necessarily have to be a type of subtraction where you put something in one piece of the pie and then the other part of the pie diminishes. In fact, if you have a very successful family life, you can have a very successful career too, and it will make you stronger in your career. In fact, many companies realize the importance of that. And companies like Google, and they develop these things to enhance life at home. Because they realize that how a person performs is very much going to depend on the whole person, not just a part, not just how they do at work. And this is really important, I think, when you realize that that about a quarter, this has come out from the business world, only a quarter of workers are actually engaged in the work that they do. The vast majority of people are disengaged from their work. And that's obviously a problem. You don't want to be disengaged from work, you don't want to be disengaged from life. This chart here is a representation of the work of Mickey Csikszentmihalyi. He's a psychologist from the University of Chicago. And he talks about this flow channel in regards to work and challenges you have in life. So it's important to balance your challenges against your skills. And if you do that, you can enter what he calls his flow channel, where you can forget about things because you're striving to achieve your goals. And I think obviously you can see if your challenges are too high and your skills are too low, you're going to have anxiety. And if your skills are too low and your skills are too high and your challenge is too low, you'll have boredom. So it's important in life to be challenged and to aim for goals that you can strive for and push yourself. It's also important to set goals. It's hard to get someplace. The great Yankee coach, Yogi Berra, once said, it's hard to get someplace if you don't know where you're going. Where do you want to be in 10 years or 20 years? If you have no sense of that, it's much harder to get there. Try to develop goals for yourself. It's often said to live a life of moderation. I've seen these people, they're moving into these houses of the size of these containers. I don't know if you guys have seen these mini houses. I wouldn't suggest that necessarily, but the idea is nice. The idea of living simpler, working less and spending time with friends or family. So if I ask you this question, how much money would you have to give someone who hasn't seen his friends for almost a year in order for him to be just as happy as a person who gets to see his friends every day? What do you guys think the answer to this question is? Someone want to take a guess? C. The answer is actually, so Nick Potavi actually studied this. He was published in the Journal of Socioeconomics and then published in his book called The Happiness Equation. And after correcting for personality, the answer is actually D, $300,000. So if you want to be as happy as getting $300,000, see your friends every day. The other thing you could consider is living closer to work. Commuting means more time with your family, and it can be miserable. This is a study published just last year, and they looked at how buying time actually promotes happiness. One of the commodities we do experience, someone said, balancing this realization that life is finite. Time is the commodity that we spend. And if you can spend money on doing things to make your time more efficient, that'll make you happier too. This is studies done across various countries. So exercising your mind is good, reading good books, getting into the sandals of these great philosophers and poets will expand your mind. Exercise is actually very good too. This is data from a prospective study, a controlled trial. They actually looked at happiness in a group where they gave them exercise and in a control group, and they were actually happier afterwards. This is a study from the British Medical Journal in 2015, and they combined 45 studies on exercise and depression and concluded that depression is something you can treat with exercise. Some of the studies are biased, but if you look at all of the studies, there is a clear signal. So you can, just with your exercise, both improve happiness and levels of depression. Now, what about other things in life? This is the UK Million Women study. They followed 1 million women over 10 years. And after 3 years of registering them, they followed, in the end, about 710,000 or so women. And they looked at variables relating to happiness and found that exercise was one of the things that predicted happiness. But there are other things that pertain to happiness. Smoking obviously is not good. Having the lowest tertile for poverty is not good. And it's interesting because sleep is really important too, but too much is not good and too little isn't good either. Now, one of the things that they found that's interesting in education is if you look at this slide here, those that had the lowest level of education actually were the happiest in this cohort of 700,000 people. And it was one of the hypotheses for this is that people in the lower tertile for education, they had spent more time in leisure. So people who were who were more educated spent less time actually having fun. I think it's important for us to play and to imagine and to wonder. I mean, I love watching my kids play. Time almost stands still watching that. Who here does things where you actually play? You have fun. Yeah. It's important to actually have fun for the sake of having fun. So there's a saying, wasted time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. So find a reason to do the things that you do. That's the 8th prescription. Now, meditation and prayer take many forms, and people find it generally very helpful. But a lot of people struggle with what to meditate on. I do think that one of the great things about meditation or prayer is that it helps focus us and connect us in the noise of life. We're so busy. We often forget about things, and when we meditate or pray, it helps us focus and forget about all the noise that's happening. There are actually lots of extensive research showing that people who are spiritually committed are happier and less stressed. And Dr. Koenig, who's had studies funded by the NIMH, has his book called The Handbook of Religion and Mental Health, and shown that people who have religious faith and practice it regularly live longer, are happier, and are healthier. So this is again the UK Million Women study. And you can see those that are part of a religious group are happier in that cohort. And of that previous study I showed you from the CDC, looking at 500,000 adolescents from grades 8 to 12, that's the data I showed you with the increasing screen time and social media use. And if you have more than 5 hours a day, you have over 50% chance of having at least one suicidal behavior. If you look at their other data in the study, one of the things that's interesting is that there are things that can overcome or are a larger variable, a larger positive variable to balance out the negative variable of, say, using a smartphone. And one of them is exercise, in-person social interactions, and attending spiritual services. And that's from that paper from the Clinical Psychological Services in 2018. I think people often talk about the power of purpose and how why changes things, this idea, this question of the why. I do think that does transform our lives. If you sit here, if you just decide that you're here for a particular purpose, that changes what you do. If you think of the dishes you did last night or the garbage you took out last week, if you did it because you loved the person whose garbage you were taking out, it changes what you do. We can change our lives by applying purpose to what we do. I choose to do this for this reason. And it can change an accidental life or a life where you have no purpose to something that's meaningful. So as you are here, if you're here because of someone you want to be happier, that's an act of love because you decide to do that. And Viktor Frankl likes to quote Nietzsche. This is not exactly what he says. It's, a why can almost bear any how. And if you understand why something is, it's much more easy to get through. So what Viktor Frankl says in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he tried to be scientific and figure out which of these people would survive. And it wasn't the people who were the smartest, the strongest, the most fed. It was actually those that had a purpose to live that survived Auschwitz. And the purpose may have been to be with family. It may have been to get it back at the Germans. It could have been any of those things. But if they had a reason, it made it much more possible. And that's how we can transform our lives, by applying purpose. It's an act of your own will. I decide to do this. The ninth thing is to be mindful of the present, of what we're thankful of, and in some ways of our own selfishness. So the Dalai Lama once said, man sacrifices his health in order to make money. Then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health. And then he is so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present. The result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he is never going to die, then dies never having really ever lived. I think it's important for us to realize that each day is a gift and that the next day is a new day. If you had a terrible day, remember tomorrow is a new day. I have 6 kids, and a lot of what I do is from cartoons. And this is from Po to Master Oogway. Actually, Oogway to Master to Po, the panda there. The past is history, the future is mystery, but today is a gift, and that is why they call it the present. Yes. What I can say of people that suffer from depression, there is often a lot of preoccupation with the past. There's a living of the past, regrets, hopelessness also about the future. And people that suffer from anxiety, they suffer the most because they perceive what could happen. Mark Twain once said, I've lived a terrible life, most of which never happened. And the point being, we worry a lot about stuff, and we suffer as if all the worst things always happen. And you can live a miserable life if you're not living in the present, because the future is very hard to control and the past is unchangeable. Sheryl Crow's song there, it's not about it's not about getting what you want, it's about wanting what you've already got. Obviously, she didn't share this with Lance Armstrong. So, the Sonia Lyubomirsky actually has done a lot of work with gratitude journaling. And one of the things that they found with randomized studies looking at 3 and 6 weeks, if you actually just take the time every week to write down 3 things that you're grateful for, at the end of 6 weeks, you'll be demonstrably happier afterwards. The other thing to keep in mind is that anger destroys us. It eats us up inside when the past is something we hold on to. That saying is, you'll never become who you want to be if you keep blaming someone else for who you are. I think forgiveness means actually letting go of hatred and letting go of the possibility of a better past. But it doesn't mean condoning what someone's done. When you forgive someone, it doesn't mean all that stuff that's happened, that was okay. No, that doesn't mean that. It just means I'm moving beyond this. This has happened. And in some ways, it stops people, that person that has hurt you in the past, from continuing to hurt you. Because the person that has wounded you in the past, when you're angry at them, they're not the ones that suffer because you're angry. It's actually you. You keep getting wounded by something that's happened in the past that they did. So forgiveness allows you to stop letting someone hurt you. And I do think that, this is where I would say the Eastern philosophies meet the Western ones. There's a problem with selfishness that we all recognize. Perhaps more so with the me generation, the generation of the selfie stick. There's this recognition of self-absorption. One of the things that's kind of ironic about the narcissistic world we live in is you're aware of everyone else's narcissism because of your own narcissism. But that is a problem. And I think we are unhappy when we turn our eyes inwards. Many of my patients, when I know they're getting better, it's usually when they start asking about me or other people. When they're talking about themselves and their inner experience, that's usually when they are suffering. You want to help people get outside of themselves and the idea of the self. One of the best talks I ever heard on materialism was actually from a parenting talk, and the person said, the problem with materialism is not so much the love of stuff. The problem with materialism is the use of people. So the proper order of things is to love people and use stuff, but we tend to use people and love stuff. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem of human history. We are trying to use other people. We are trying to gain control over them. We want, that is the struggle we experience. And the proper order thing is actually to love people. Which brings us to the 10th prescription, which is to be open to love. So Peter Kreeft once said, "Love is the soul of everything valuable. The most precious gift in the world given without love is worthless, but the cheapest gift in the world given with love is priceless." The Grant Study, which began in the 30s, it continues to this day. It started in 1938, so it's coming on to 80 years. They studied roughly 270 Harvard undergraduate men. The study has expanded. And in the 70s, they included a cohort from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, the Gluick study. So the Gluick and the Grant study were combined in the 70s. And they have followed this cohort to the present time, over 4 different scientific directors and millions of dollars. So they interviewed these people every 2 years for the last 80 years. And they found some surprising things. One of the persons in the cohort was John F. Kennedy. But one of the things they found was that our levels of happiness are determined by our relationships. And that early on, it really does make a difference. But it also makes a difference later in life. So your strength of your relationships at the age of 50 predicted your health and your survival at the age of 80. Much better than your blood pressure, your cholesterol levels. They did blood tests on these people. The much better predictor of your health was actually your relationships, which is very surprising. That the quality of your relationships matter to your health. It also predicted your survival and also the onset of dementia. So George Valiant, who's one of the directors of the study until about 10, 15 years ago, said that after 75 years and $20 million just on the Grant study, the straightforward 5-word conclusion is love is happiness, full stop. So making relationships a priority should be something we all do. In fact, that's the basis for interpersonal psychotherapy for depression. For those that aren't aware, one of the modalities we use to treat depression is to improve relationships you have. It doesn't make any assumptions of what's causing the depression. We only know that if your relationships are better, your depression is going to be better. So that's the goal of using that particular kind of therapy. I like the Swedish proverb. It says, shared joy is double joy, shared sorrow is half sorrow. You know, if you think about it, if you talk to your friend about something you just went through and you share that with them, it's less painful. And when you experience something joyful, it's no fun if you're not with someone else. And my patients have asked me as time has gone on, how, you know, if I could change anything about my life, what would they change? And they've told me consistently two things. They have told me that they had wished they had spent more time with their family, and they wish they had had more children. So they told me this early on in my career. And what does family stand for? Family stands for forget about me, I love you. You know, I think when you have children, you realize that as you look at this child, this baby that's sleeping there, that no matter what happened to you, it's much more important what happens to this child, and you can forget yourself in that kind of thing. That kind of forgetfulness is a kind of bliss too. And I remember talking to these people that were running the shelters, and they were saying, well, some people don't have family. And I would say that the relationships that they have with the people in the shelters, they are their family. You know? And studies actually have shown, there are some larger studies that have looked at whether or not people are truly happier giving rather than receiving. And the answer is quite clearly yes. So this was published in the Journal of Science in 2008. And they looked at, they had 3 parts to this study. They first looked at an association study for 600 or 700 people, and they looked at their incomes and how much they spend on other people and how much they spend on themselves, and compared their levels of happiness. And clearly they showed that if you spent more money on other people, you were more happy. And they actually developed an experimental paradigm. They first introduced it at UBC, and they looked at 2 groups. They gave half the people money with increasing amounts to spend on themselves and half to spend on other people. The cohort that spent the money on themselves were no happier at the end of the study. But the cohort that spent money on other people, no matter how much they spent, even if it was $5, they were happier. Again, it was replicated in another study with about 500 people, a 6-week prospective study, and they found the same thing. If people spent money on other people, they were happy. If they spent money on themselves, they were no happier at the end of the study. So Martin Luther King once said, "Those who are not looking for happiness are the most likely to find it, because those who are searching forget that the surest way to be happy is to seek the happiness for others." And I consider myself very blessed to work in my field. I think any of us that are working in mental health, we also are blessed because our work is to try and make people happy. And it is an incredibly rewarding experience. You know, making one person smile cannot change the whole world, but it can change their world. So the 10 lessons or 10 prescriptions are to realize that money can only buy so much, to live with integrity, to accept the things that you can't change, to have the courage to change the things that you can, to realize that pain may be part of happiness, to be able to learn, to be able to be balanced, to be grounded, to be mindful, and to be open to love. And this is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Beecher. It says, "In this world, it is not what we take up, but what we give up that makes us rich." So that's the end.